Today, I'm going to tell you 3 very spooky stories that, depending on your interpretation, you could view all 3 of these as ghost stories. But before we get into those stories, if you're a fan of the strange, dark, and mysterious delivered in story format, then you've come to the right place because that's all we do, and we upload once a week. So, if that's of interest to you, please offer to house sit for the like button. But as soon as you get there, just take all their belongings and put them out on the curb with a big sign that just says free right next to them, and then just leave. Also, please subscribe to our channel and turn on all notifications so you don't miss any of our weekly uploads. Okay, let's get into today's stories. One morning in the summer of 1876, a doctor named Lewis Allard walked down the hallway of a hospital in Papeete, Tahiti. Tahiti is an island east of Australia. Lewis was just about to step into his office when he heard the hospital doors open, and he looked over to see a few policemen walking in, carrying this unconscious man on a stretcher. Just from the looks of the way this guy was dressed, Dr. Allard could tell he was a sailor. So a lot of Dr. Allard's patients were sailors because Papeete was a port town. So if people got sick or injured at sea and then docked in Papeete, they would come to the hospital right there. So Dr. Allard walked over to the police and asked them what was going on with the sailor. And the officers explained that this man's friends had found him unresponsive that morning, apparently after a very long night of drinking. Dr. Allard nodded and then motioned for the police to follow him and bring this guy with him, and he led them over to an exam room where he had them lay out the sailor on a table so that Dr. Allard could look him over. The sailor appeared to be pretty young. He was in his 20s maybe, and he appeared very healthy and strong. But when the doctor checked for a pulse, there was none. And so after checking a couple more times to make sure it wasn't just a very weak pulse, the doctor ultimately concluded that, this sailor was not just unresponsive. The sailor was dead, and if Dr. Allard had to guess, he very likely died from alcohol poisoning, given his friends said, the night before, this guy had had a really heavy night of drinking, and here he was, so alcohol poisoning. So this hospital had a policy for how to handle the death of foreign sailors in Tahiti. Basically, the doctor who pronounced the sailor dead would then arrange for them to be buried in a public cemetery. And in fact, the hospital kept these cheap wooden coffins in the hospital morgue for this exact purpose. And so Dr. Allard followed protocol and asked the police to go inform the sailor's friends of his death, and then the doctor went to the hospital's morgue to arrange for a coffin. A few hours later, Dr. Allard was back in his office when he heard a knock at his door. He told whoever it was to come in, but when the door swung open, the doctor was surprised at who he saw there. It was the 4 local gravediggers who he had called earlier to bury that sailor who had just died. Now, generally speaking, Dr. Allard had virtually no interactions with the gravediggers after he hired them. He would tell them to bury the body, and they would do that and go on their separate way. Like there was no reason for the gravediggers to come back and check in with the doctor. But as the doctor is looking at these 4 guys trying to figure out what was going on here, he quickly assessed that, these guys weren't here just to chat. They were here because they looked spooked. And before Dr. Allard could ask any questions about, what was going on here, one of these gravediggers began to speak. And in sort of a rapid and sort of anxious tone, he said, as we were carrying the coffin over to the gravesite, it began to shake like the person inside the coffin was alive. And then we heard all these moaning sounds coming from inside of this nailed shut coffin. And we all got so panicked that we just dropped the coffin and we ran here to tell you. Now, Dr. Allard was pretty surprised by what he was hearing, but he's also thinking that, when he hired these 4 gravediggers, they were at a local pub and they were drinking. And so he's thinking to himself, maybe something strange happened, with this coffin, or much more likely, these 4 guys are drunk. And that what they've sort of said here is just some figment of their imagination, that they're not professional, they're just drunk guys who are coming here screwing up my day. And so sort of annoyed, Dr. Allard's like, hey, I'm telling you, that guy is dead, okay? This isn't a ghost scenario, but if you're so worried about it, why don't you go get a police officer, have them come over and inspect the coffin, make sure the person is really dead in there, and then once they confirm that, please do your job and bury this guy. And so the gravediggers, they kind of, look down sort of awkwardly and they're like, okay, we'll go do that. And they turned and they left. And then Dr. Allard got back to work. And then a few hours later, Dr. Allard heard another knock on his door. And this time when the door opened, it was a police officer. And it was actually the officer that the 4 gravediggers had gone and found at Dr. Allard's suggestion. And he had gone over, checked the coffin, and the coffin wasn't moving, it wasn't making any weird sounds, it was sealed shut, there was nothing going on. And so the officer eventually instructed the gravediggers, to go ahead and bury it, there's nothing going on here. And so the gravediggers had, at that point, buried the coffin, and that had been that. And so the officer was here just to tell Dr. Allard that, hey, it's all good, he's buried, we can move on. About a week later, Dr. Allard had basically forgotten about this whole snafu around the coffin and whatever was going on with it. He was sort of on to the next thing, and he was out like he normally was at night to go for a walk. And the area that he liked to walk in the most was actually the cemetery. Not because he had some sort of morbid obsession, but because, it was often, vacant. There was nobody there. And so it was a peaceful place to go walking. And so, he's strolling through the cemetery like usual, and he's not seeing anybody like usual. But as it began to get dark, he was walking down this one row of headstones, and he looked up ahead, and he could have sworn he saw somebody standing behind a tree with their body sort of half out of the tree, half behind the tree, sort of half obscured. And he stopped and he's looking, and the whole thing just sort of felt off. Like, what is this person doing? Is that a person? Like, what's going on here? And so he's staring, and as he's looking, sure enough, this dark silhouette steps out from behind this tree. And the way they stepped out, it was like they stepped out, turned, and faced Dr. Allard, and just stood there, clearly looking right at Dr. Allard. But they're pretty far away from Dr. Allard, like there's a good distance between them. But immediately, Dr. Allard felt threatened by this person, or whatever it was. He didn't even know if it was a person. He couldn't tell if it was his mind playing tricks on him or not. He's just staring at this thing that looked like it was looking at him. And so Dr. Allard instinctively, who's now feeling a little bit frightened, turned and just started walking away, like he was done walking in the cemetery for the night. And so he turns and he starts walking, but then it's like the hairs in the back of his neck stood up. He just felt like this person, whoever it is, they're still watching me. And so he stopped after just a couple of steps and he turned back around. And now this figure is clearly marching directly towards Dr. Allard. They're almost running. They're walking real fast right towards Dr. Allard. And so now Dr. Allard's terrified. He knows there's something happening here. Why would this person be doing this? Like, is it a person? Like, what's happening here? And so Dr. Allard, he turns and starts to run. And as he's running, he hears this horrible high-pitched scream echo across the entire cemetery. And then he looks back one last time and he sees the face of this figure, this person charging towards him. And it's the same guy who died a week ago, the same sailor that he buried, the one who presumably was moving around in the coffin the gravediggers were so scared of. It was him, and he jumped on Dr. Allard and began throttling him, and Dr. Allard's on the ground staring at this ghastly face. This scream is coming out of him. He had no idea what was going on, and then Dr. Allard just blacked out. A few minutes later, Dr. Allard came to, and he sat up suddenly, and he's looking around, and there's nobody there. It's just a dark, vacant cemetery. No sign of the dead sailor's ghost or whatever, or whoever it was. They're gone. And Dr. Allard's just sitting there, his heart's racing still, and he's telling himself, like, did that even just happen? Like, it felt so real. His neck was sore from, what he felt was this guy, this thing attacking him. But at the same time, he was so sure that the face that he had seen on this person was the dead sailor's face. But how could that be? He's dead. He's buried. How could that be? And so ultimately, Dr. Allard, he got up and he hustled back to his house. But over the coming weeks, Dr. Allard sort of spiraled into madness. Because it was like every day, all the time, he would see out of the corner of his eye for a second, like a glimpse of this dead sailor's ghost. And it was always that face, that ghastly face, that shrieking face looking right at him. And he'd turn and the face would disappear. But Dr. Allard, he just felt like he was almost being haunted, that something had happened, like that attack in the cemetery. It had felt so real. He felt like now this ghost was literally haunting him. But he couldn't tell anyone. I mean, he's a doctor. What's he gonna do? Tell people that a ghost is haunting him? He didn't know what to do. And so what he ended up doing after several weeks is he just began staying home and laying in bed, basically feigning illness to avoid leaving the house. And he would just lay there with his eyes eyes closed basically all day, because as soon as he opened his eyes, he would see this dead sailor's face. He really was losing his mind. And then eventually, when Dr. Allard knew he had to stop basically staying in bed all day and go back to the hospital and sort of function in society again, go back to work, otherwise people were gonna start asking questions here, like, what's going on with you? And he didn't have an answer, When that time came and he knew it was sort of like, okay, go back to normal or tell people about this, well, what Dr. Allard ultimately did is he decided to walk up to the roof of his house and throw himself off. He literally couldn't live with what he believed was this ghost haunting him 24/7. When the doctor's close friends found out that the doctor had taken his own life, they immediately went to the police and said, hey, wait a minute, we think this has something to do with what he was dealing with over the past several weeks. So the doctor, despite not wanting to tell anybody about, his haunting, he did sort of begin to tell a couple of his close friends. Now, he was sort of subtle about it, but he began telling people that he's like, yeah, I keep seeing that dead sailor's face everywhere I go. I just keep seeing him. Now, he didn't highlight the fact that he was basically losing his mind over it and thought it was literally a ghost. But a couple of his close friends were aware that it almost seemed like, Dr. Allard was effectively having a mental breakdown over this dead sailor. And they did sort of connect that Dr. Allard sort of felt haunted by this dead sailor. And so, said close friends ultimately went to the police and said, hey, I know this is a stretch, but the doctor kind of thought he was being haunted by this dead sailor before he died. We think that has to do with why he took his own life. And sort of amazingly, the police, the way they responded to this was, okay, we're gonna look into this. We're gonna investigate the haunting, so to speak. And what they did is they exhumed the coffin of that dead sailor. They didn't know what else to do. They just decided they would do that. And so they raised the coffin out of the ground and they open it up and they cannot believe what they see. So it would turn out those 4 gravediggers had been totally justified in being scared about what they thought they heard and felt in that coffin when they were going to bury it. Because the sailor was not dead. He was just so drunk that it felt like he was dead. They couldn't feel his pulse. Dr. Allard had been wrong. The sailor was not dead. He was totally alive. And so as he was being carried over to the gravesite to be buried, he really was moving around inside the coffin and moaning because he was horribly hungover, but totally alive and, grappling with the fact that he's now, confined inside of this coffin. He likely had no idea what was going on, so you can imagine the types of sounds and things he might be doing. And so the gravediggers, they were right to be scared. They did get a police officer. The police officer came over, and for whatever reason, when he inspected the coffin, he saw it was sealed. There was no movement inside the coffin. It was totally quiet. So, the sailor inside, he just wasn't moving or making any sound. And so the police officer greenlit burying him. So the living sailor inside the coffin is buried underground by these gravediggers, and they go their separate ways afterwards. But then that sailor wakes up again. He begins thrashing around after being buried in the ground. And he actually managed to break out of the coffin and climb out of the ground. He saved himself. He literally, survived being buried alive. But he was furious at the doctor, who so cavalierly just decided he was dead and I'll go bury him. And so he decided he would play a prank on the doctor to get back at him. So what he did is he filled his coffin up with rocks and he sealed it back up and he reburied it so nobody would know anything. And then for the next week or so, he just kind of hid out and didn't let anybody know that he was actually still alive. And then, after about a week, he knew the doctor took his walks in that cemetery, and so he hid behind a tree in the cemetery and waited for the doctor to be alone making his walk. And when he saw him, it was the sailor, fully alive in the flesh, stepping out from behind the tree, looking at the doctor. That was him. It really was the sailor. And he really did run forward, shrieking, pretending to be a ghost. And he attacked Dr. Allard, basically giving him the impression that his angry ghost was attacking him. And then after Dr. Allard passed out on the ground, the sailor ran off. But for Dr. Allard, who fully believed that sailor was dead, can you imagine what he thought when he saw, the sailor attacking him and shrieking in the middle of the cemetery? He fully believed that was the sailor's ghost, and he had this totally real experience getting attacked by the ghost. And so even though he survived the encounter, it drove him mad. He began seeing the dead sailor, the ghost, everywhere he went, and it eventually drove him to kill himself. And so when the police opened up that coffin, all they saw were all the rocks the sailor had left behind. But following the doctor's suicide, that sailor apparently skipped town and was never seen again. It begins here. From the director of It comes It, Welcome to Derry, the chilling new HBO original series exploring one of horror's biggest terrors, Pennywise the Clown. Set in 1960s Derry, Maine, the new HBO original series premieres Sunday, October 26th on HBO Max. Also, you can listen to the official It, Welcome to Derry podcast wherever you get your podcasts. On the night of August 30th, 1892, a 20-year-old man named Benjamin Trudell climbed into his bed inside of the Deer Park Life-Saving Station, which was a small government building right off the coast of Lake Superior in Michigan. Benjamin was a member of the Life-Saving Service, which was a precursor to the US Coast Guard, and he was currently working overnight as a surfman, which was basically like a lifeguard, but specifically for ships that were out on the lake. He was there with a bunch of other surfmen who were all taking shifts, either sleeping, patrolling the beach, or staying awake inside the station in case somebody came looking for help. Benjamin had just finished a 4-hour beach patrol, which had been pretty uneventful, but at the same time, he was still walking around for 4 hours on loose sand, and so he was pretty tired. And so now that he was back at the station, he had a little bit of time where he could basically take a nap. And so he set his alarm for 4 hours later, which is when he would need to be awake in the station to take on another shift. And then he told his fellow surfmen that he was gonna close his eyes for a minute. And then he climbed into bed and fell asleep. A few hours later, though, Ben shot up in bed and began frantically looking around the room. He was covered in sweat, his heart was racing, and after a second, he realized that, he's okay. He's in the station, he's safe, and what had just happened to him was just a dream. He had had a terrifying nightmare, but it had felt so real that it really took him a second to, understand that that's all it had been, just a dream. In this dream, Benjamin was walking along the coast of Lake Superior, like he did during his nightly beach patrol, and it was dark out and there was this awful thunderstorm, and the rain was coming down so hard that Benjamin could barely see, and in fact he almost felt like the impacts of the individual raindrops almost hurt his skin, like they were acid striking his skin. Then suddenly, through this wall of rain right in front of him, this man who Ben didn't recognize kind of stumbled into view. And this man was wearing very nice clothing, like he was on his way to a party or something. But, they're down at the coast of this lake, and it's storming out, like it didn't make any sense. But Benjamin, he just stared at the sky and didn't say anything. And the guy looked right back at Benjamin, and without saying a word, he just reached out and really aggressively shook Benjamin's hand. And then, as Benjamin is watching his hand be shaken around by this guy with wild eyes turns and he points out to the lake that's right next to them. And even though he didn't say anything, he pointed with this level of urgency, like there's something out there, something bad, and you need to pay attention to whatever it is. And so Benjamin, he turned, and his hand's still being shaken by this guy, and he looks out, but it's just a wall of water. He can't even see the lake, and he has no idea what this guy is trying to tell him. And it was at that point that, Benjamin sat up and he was awake again. Now, objectively, Benjamin understood that while this dream definitely was creepy, it wasn't really terrifying. It was raining and storming, and a random guy came up and shook his hand and pointed at the lake. That's not terrifying. But for some reason for Benjamin, it just felt so real that was the thing that made it so unsettling. It felt like he really had been out there and really had this interaction. Now, Benjamin was not the type of guy that would, find meaning in dreams. He basically chalked dreams up as just that, just dreams. But there was something different about this dream. He felt almost intuitively like what had just happened in his dream was a warning that man, whoever he was telling Benjamin something, and it had to do with the lake, but he didn't know what it was. But as Benjamin thought about this, he knew how sort of crazy that sounded. And he figured that maybe he was just kind of caught up in the immediacy of having just had this dream, that really the only reason he felt like it had weight is because it just happened. And so maybe if he just went outside and got some fresh air and let some time pass, that he would, let this dream fade into the ether and he'd go back to normal life. And sure enough, when he got outside and got some fresh air, he did feel better. But he did still feel like that dream meant something. And so he just walked down to the coast of Lake Superior, where he was in his dream, to the other surfmen who were down there doing their own patrol. And there, there was nothing unusual happening. The lake, it was so calm. And Benjamin, he went up to one of the surfmen and just kind of told them about this dream. And he was almost joking about it. He's like, yeah, it felt so real that I almost feel like it was a warning of some kind. But yeah, it's just a dream. And the other surfmen who were listening just were like, yeah, that's crazy dream, huh? And that was it. The following day, around noon, Benjamin and his fellow surfmen were hanging out inside the life-saving station when all of a sudden, this guy comes stumbling into the station and he looked awful. He was soaking wet, he was covered in all these cuts and bruises, and he was visibly shaking so much that it almost looked like he was about to collapse right there onto the floor. Benjamin immediately asked the guy, hey, what's going on? What's brought you here? What's happening? And the man, who clearly was struggling to just breathe at this point, sort of composed himself and just said, I was out on the lake last night on a ship that sunk. And as soon as he said that, Benjamin was in total disbelief. Because if a ship sunk on Lake Superior, the life-saving service that Benjamin was a part of was supposed to know, because they patrolled the lake and tracked the vessels out on the water. So it seems sort of impossible that a ship could sink and his crew, the surfmen, would somehow not even know about it. And then, at the same time Benjamin is thinking this, he couldn't help but go back to that dream he had had. It had happened last night, and it just seemed like this guy was warning Benjamin about something out on the lake. It just seemed way too coincidental that this guy's here the next day talking about a shipwreck out on the lake around the same time frame. The survivor of this shipwreck explained that the ship had been really far out on the lake, probably too far away from shore for them to even see. And he said that he and several other people had made it onto a lifeboat, but the boat had capsized. And he had spent hours and hours swimming to shore, and he had just gotten here, and that's why he'd come in, and he was soaking wet and so tired because he had just swam all night. And he said he didn't know about any of the other survivors or if there were any other survivors. All he knew is that he was here and he has no idea what else happened. And so Benjamin and the other surfmen immediately gave this man a blanket and some food and some water, and then they quickly sent out a fleet of boats to go search the lake to hopefully find other victims of the shipwreck. That evening and all through the night, Benjamin and his co-workers sailed rescue boats back and forth all across Lake Superior looking for survivors, but all they could find were 4 dead bodies. But the man who had swam to shore and told them about this shipwreck said there had to be more people out there. He said there had been 27 people on this ship, including him, when it had sunk, which meant a lot of people were still definitely unaccounted for. So while some of the surfmen continued to search out on the water, Benjamin and a small team decided they would actually search the coastline itself and see if anybody washed up on shore. And so early on the morning of September 1st, so now the surfmen have been out searching for people for over 24 hours at this point, Benjamin and his team were walking down the coastline, and they looked up ahead and they saw what appeared to be 2 people laying on the sand. And so of course they ran up to them, and unfortunately they discovered that, it was a man and a woman who were lying face down in the sand, and they were not breathing. They were dead. And so Ben, he knelt down next to the man and he began rolling his body over to get a look at him. And when he did that, 2 things happened. When he rolled him over and actually got a look at this guy's face, he saw immediately that it was the exact same guy from his dream. The guy who had shaken his hand and pointed out at the lake. It was him, definitely. And as he's having this revelation and he's sort of kneeling there in shock, the man's body, he's sort of rolling it over, and as it completes the rollover, the man's limp hand falls directly onto Ben's hand, like a handshake. Ben would later learn that the ship that sunk out on Lake Superior the night before was called the Western Reserve, and apparently it had sunk during the exact same time that Ben had that nightmare. And the man that Ben saw in his dream, the man that had been pointing out at the lake and shaking his hand in the dream, and then Ben found on the shore dead, who then in his death flopped over and put his hand in his hand all over again, was a guy named Robert Minch. and he was part owner of the Western Reserve ship. For the rest of Benjamin's life, he believed that Robert's spirit had actually visited him in that nightmare to warn him about the shipwreck that was literally happening right then and there. That he was shaking his hand and pointing out at the lake like, hey, go out there right now. There's something horrible happening. A ship is sinking. People need your help. But when Benjamin woke up, despite really feeling like this meant something, this dream was a warning, he didn't actually go out and search the lake. And so as a result, the ship sank. In fact, of the 27 people who were on board that ship that sank, 26 died, including Robert, the owner. The only survivor was that man who swam to shore and told them after the shipwreck had already happened. On the afternoon of September 20th, 1989, a 70-year-old man named Jim Moore and his wife Clara walked along the beach on a tiny island off the coast of South Carolina. It was called Pawleys Island, and it was less than 4 miles long and only wide enough to fit one main road with beachfront houses on either side. Jim and Clara lived in one of those beachfront houses, and every afternoon they would go out and walk the beach together. That particular day, as they walked, Jim could see some clouds gathering off in the distance, right above the ocean. And he'd actually seen a weather report recently about this big storm called Hurricane Hugo that was supposed to be heading their way in the next couple of days. Living on an island, Jim and Clara were pretty used to getting warnings like that. I mean, storms were sort of a big deal on an island because you're pretty isolated. And they were just planning to evacuate if the weather, got pretty bad. But for now, it did seem like the weather wasn't too bad, so they were sticking it out. However, it did sort of seem like basically everybody else on Pawleys Island had taken the storm a little bit more seriously, and most of them had already evacuated. And in fact, as Jim and Clara are walking, normally they would see lots of people out doing what they were doing, walking the beach, but today, there was just one person really far down the beach, just this one guy walking towards them, but that was it. The rest of the beach was basically deserted. But Jim and Clara were, veterans of Pawleys Island and certainly veterans of other storms that they had weathered in the past, and so they weren't worried yet. And they just continued to, walk down the beach and chat and just kind of stare out at these growing clouds and just have a normal day. But as they're walking, Jim was sort of keeping an eye on this guy, this one other guy on the beach that was walking towards them. Now, he wasn't literally walking towards them, he was just sort of walking in the other direction. And so inevitably, both Jim and Clara and this guy were going to pass each other, and as Jim got closer to this guy, he realized he actually didn't recognize him. And realistically, Pawleys Island was so small that Jim and Clara basically knew everybody, or at least could recognize everybody. But this guy, who was wearing this long gray coat and this wide-brimmed hat, and he kind of had his head down, Jim didn't recognize. And he told Clara, hey, who is this guy? As they're walking closer and closer, and she's like, I don't know, I've never seen him before. But, there was no cause for alarm here. It's broad daylight, and who cares if there's a stranger on the island? Of course, people that live here have guests all the time. This is probably just somebody visiting somebody who lives here. And so they're walking, getting closer and closer. And then finally, when Jim and Clara were about, 10 feet away from this guy, the guy in the big gray coat, Jim, to be polite, just said, hey, how you doing? Because they're the only people on the beach. You can't just ignore each other. But the guy in the gray coat, he just kept that big hat sort of angled down and just briskly walked right past Jim and Clara and didn't even acknowledge them, which is there's nobody else here. What are you doing? It's sort of rude. And so Jim and Clara, they look at each other like, that's weird. They keep on walking. And then for whatever reason, Jim just turns around and looks towards this guy, the guy who had just passed them, the guy in the gray coat. And when he looked, he just stopped because the guy was gone. And there's nowhere to go. There is no, shrubs or trees or anything. This is a wide open, flat beach. And this guy has just passed Jim and Clara seconds ago. He can't be anywhere else. He has to be on the beach. There's nowhere to hide. And so Jimmy grabs Clara and he's like, look, he's gone. And she turns around and she's like, what's going on? That's not possible. And they're looking did he go in the ocean? But they're looking out in the water and there's no sign of him. The only place, maybe he could have gone is if as soon as he passed by Jim and Clara, he hard turned and ran inland and hid, behind one of the houses. But that's pretty far away. It just didn't seem possible that in that short of an amount of time, he could get up there and hide. And also, why would you do that? That's such bizarre behavior. And so Jim and Clara, they're just standing there like trying to come up with some reasonable theory to explain where this guy went, but they just couldn't do it. It was like this guy just disappeared. And so eventually, Jim and Clara just had to turn back around and finish their walk and make their way home. And the whole time, all they could talk about was this disappearing man in the gray coat, because it defied any rational explanation. Where did he go? When the couple finally got back to their house, by this point, the clouds that had been gathering outside were now very dark, and it really did seem like a serious storm was on the horizon. And then when they turned on the TV, they put on the Weather Channel, and there was this bulletin that the South Carolina state government had actually issued an evacuation order to all inhabitants of Pawleys Island, because apparently Hurricane Hugo was getting bigger and faster and more destructive, and it appeared like Pawleys Island was clearly going to be in the path of this hurricane. And so at this point, Jim and Clara forgot about the gray man and realized like, hey, we got to pack our stuff up and go. We thought we had maybe a day or two before we'd have to evacuate, but no more. We got to go right now. And fortunately for them, they actually had an adult daughter who lived right on mainland South Carolina. And so they could stay with her on short notice, no problem. And so they quickly packed up, they hopped in their car, and they drove on the one main road until they hit the bridge that went over the ocean. They made their way across the bridge onto mainland South Carolina and over to their daughter's house. And once they got there, their daughter was obviously very happy to see them, happy they were safe. And they would just spend the whole day basically just sitting there with the Weather Channel on, watching reports about Hurricane Hugo. And over the course of the day, the news got more and more dire. Hurricane Hugo was poised to be this enormous, destructive storm that was not slowing down at all. And unfortunately, Pawleys Island was really looking like one of the main areas that was going to be affected by this storm. In fact, the meteorologist was saying, like, it is not safe to be on the island at this point. I mean, there's a chance that all the structures on the island could be leveled by the end of this storm. So Jim and Clara, they're obviously happy they are safe, on mainland South Carolina with their daughter, but they live on that island. Their house, everything they own, it's on that island. And so the idea that they were just helpless and their house is going to be destroyed was sort of just terrible. Like, what can you even do? You're helpless. And so as they began to sort of spiral into all their anxieties around what's going to happen, eventually one of them said, hey, let's just accept that we're in this position and let's just change the subject. We're safe here. Don't worry about what the storm's gonna do. Let's just change the subject. And the first subject that was raised was Jim and Clara's encounter with that strange disappearing man in the gray cloak. And so Jim and Clara, they told the story to their daughter about this weird guy they saw and how he just kind of vanished. And their daughter was like really interested listening to the story. And when they were done telling it, she looked at her parents and was like, I think you might have seen the gray man. Now, Jim and Clara had lived on Pawleys Island long enough to know about the legend of the Gray Man. As the story goes, 150 years earlier, there was this sailor who was making his way to Pawleys Island to see his fiancée who was there. And when he got to the island, he unfortunately basically fell into quicksand and died. And so the fiancée is totally heartbroken. She's basically losing her mind over the sudden loss of her love. But a couple of days after her fiancé, the sailor, had died, she saw him walking on the beach on Pawleys Island. And he was wearing this long gray coat and this big wide-brimmed hat. And he was walking towards her and she was so overjoyed. She knows it doesn't make any sense, but she runs to her beloved sailor, and right as she reaches him, he disappears. Now, Jim and Clara, they couldn't help but see the overlap here. I mean, they saw, a guy wearing a long gray coat with a big wide-brimmed hat who, was walking on the beach, who then disappeared. It did sort of seem like the legend of the Gray Man, but neither Jim nor Clara really felt like that actually was the explanation here. But at the same time, Jim did feel like, man, that is a weird coincidence. Over the next couple of days, Hurricane Hugo made landfall, and it was absolutely vicious. And then finally, when it passed and it was safe to go back to Pawleys Island, Jim and Clara loaded up their car, they said bye to their daughter, and they made the drive out there. And as they were crossing the bridge to get out to Pawleys Island, along with all the other inhabitants that were going back, they immediately could tell that Pawleys Island really had been leveled. I mean, the roads themselves were badly damaged, there were street signs and trees everywhere, and as they're getting closer, they can see that basically their whole community has been leveled. All the buildings are destroyed. I mean, it's like a war zone. Now, Jim and Clara had sort of braced themselves for this because they had heard on the news that sure enough, this hurricane had been as bad as expected and Pawleys Island had taken a direct hit. And so they drove across the island until they reached their property. And when they got to their property, they could not believe what they saw. So there's actually one more part to the legend of the Gray Man ghost. And that is when the woman saw who she believed was her dead fiance walking up the beach with his gray coat and his big brimmed hat, and she runs up and he disappears and it's so tragic. That's not the end of the story, because the woman was so upset by seeing what she thought was her fiance again. He's back from the dead, oh my goodness, and then he vanishes. It's like she had to experience his death a second time, and it made her go crazy. It was like so much grief, it was so overwhelming that she couldn't live with it. And in fact, quickly after seeing, his ghost disappear, she was sent off the island to a hospital. She was basically institutionalized. And while she was off the island, immediately after she left the island, this huge storm rolled through and leveled Pawleys Island. And only one building survived. It was her house. Inexplicably, her house was untouched, completely untouched. Everybody else's ruined. So keep that in mind, because when Jim and Clara returned to Pawleys Island following Hurricane Hugo, whose house was the only house left standing? Theirs. Utterly untouched. Their neighbors' houses, all the local businesses, everything gone. Their house, untouched. And just so you know, the legend of the Gray Man, people believe if you see the Gray Man, he's warning you to leave the island in advance of a storm, like he apparently did for his fiance. He warned her, get off the island. And if you heed his warning, the legend goes, your house will be spared. And people believe that's exactly what happened to Jim and Clara. Thank you so much for watching. Let me know what you thought of today's episode in the comments. And remember, we have hundreds of videos for you to binge right now. But if you're looking for a recommendation from me of that one video that's worth your time, well, it's this one right here. So give it a watch. All right, until next time, see ya.